Uh, Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining from different part of the world for this TDR Global webinar series. And today we will learn about one of the most important aspect of research, which is funding. And as we know, high quality research requires access to sufficient funding. However, in many low and middle income countries, source for research funding are often limited. And as a result, research institutions must compete to get funding from many sources, including international sources from donors. And often the budget are donor driven and sometimes not aligned with the local needs. So today, we have several experts joining us in this webinar to share their experience in managing research funds. And we will introduce all of the speakers before their session. And today's webinar is also special because this is a joint collaboration between TDR Global Asia and TDR Global Africa. And I'm Trisasi Lestari, focal point of TDR Global Asia, and my colleague Franklin Glosa, focal point from TDR Global Africa. We will moderate this webinar together. And before we go any further, I would like to briefly explain the format for today's webinar. You can interact with all of the speakers using the chat box, or you can also post your question in the Q&A box down there. You can upvote a question if you like by clicking on the thumbs up button. So it will be easier for the panelists to find the question. And in the end of the webinar, I will post a link to a short survey to get your feedback on some of the things that we could improve in our future TDR Global webinar series. Without further ado, I would like to invite Franklin to introduce our speakers for the first session. Time is yours, Franklin.
Thank you very much, Sasi. And I also use the opportunity to welcome everybody to this month's webinar. Okay, so our main speaker for today is Dr. Gary Aslian, who is a TDR, WHO TDR Manager, Partnerships and Governance, Essence on Health Research Secretariat. So Gary will be speaking to us largely about the 5 keys to improving research costing. You give the general overview, and then the other presenters will then continue with theirs. So straight to you, Gary, if you're ready, you can take it over.
Okay, so I'm here again on behalf of TDR and Essence. Welcome everybody. This webinar has another partner, which is SARIMA, the Southern African Research and Innovation Management Association. And I will be sharing this presentation with my colleague Karen Dyson, who will join me in this process. So just a little bit to begin with, we're focusing on this good practice document. That's our first slide. I will give you a bit of a sense what Essence is in a minute. It's a second edition, as you see. Obviously, presenting a document is easy, but also not very easy. So document will be only the introductory part, and then the rest of our experts will dive into more specific examples. Essence is an initiative that TDR has been secretariat for in the last 13 years or so, since 2008. It brought together various funding agencies that really vary in their mandates, and they come from high and low income countries, sometimes from middle income countries. Over 40 members, and what they do, they try to align their efforts when it comes to funding research in LMICs, or how best they can really harmonize and optimize their funding with the goals in countries. I already mentioned that they're very varied in their way they work. However, this area of research management and costing of research clearly has been an area of interest to all of them. Most of them encounter issues, and also those who they fund really look for further guidance on this. And it's one of our oldest projects dating back to 2012. There are other areas that Essence focusing on, both in terms of producing good documents such as this, let's say in terms of capacity building or implementation research, but there are also other areas that the initiative brings together its members to work on reviewing investments of who is funding what, or looking at some broader other policy issues and other working groups that are about 4 or 5 of them. The probably next slide. The idea with 5 keys, again, dating back to 2012, was really quite similar to what we have at the moment, although I think, and Karen and others who were also involved back then can attest to improved environment when it comes to funding or costing, or at least understanding of these terms. But there is an increased need, again, continues for funding from outside of the countries where research happens. So that is still with us. And then obviously there's better awareness now of the need for indirect costs and what they mean for sustainability of research, and more focus on managing the grants and also determining how to calculate this indirect costs in LMIC institutions. We, as with other Essence good practice documents, they are for members, meaning they are for the funding agencies, but also for grantees and those who are applying or are part of the research infrastructures in countries, universities, institutions, and others who are working on this. So it's both, yeah, we're with these kinds of webinars and other engagements, we're looking at disseminating and utilizing the 5 keys and good practices focused on this. I'm gonna hand over to Karen, who will continue, please.
Thank you, Gary. I just want to get to the next slide quickly. There you go. So good afternoon, colleagues. As Gary mentioned, we unfortunately do not have time to present this document in detail, but we hope that through what we present, you will be encouraged to go back and read the document. So based on surveys and focus groups that were held with grantees and with funders, the content was structured under 5 themes that are called the keys, with research costing and in particular indirect cost as the central theme. It is, however, anchored within an institutional context, and therefore you will see that other aspects like the relationship between funders and institutions, like creating this enabling environment and capacity strengthening, are also addressed, in addition to the more technical aspects that are covered in the 4th key of the document. The webinar today will focus primarily on key 1, 3, and 5. We have different series of webinars, others focusing more on the technical aspects. There's another one later this week, for example, that will cover key 4 in more detail. So each of the keys the content are supplemented by case studies. There's also an addendum with additional case studies that's not incorporated in the main document where good practices are shared. Each key also have notes from the field which provides perspectives of institutions and funders who participated in the surveys. And each key then concludes with recommendations for good practice. So this is the basic structure of the good practice document. So when we cost research, as you know, we mean that we try to determine what is costing the institution, considering both the direct and the indirect costs, sometimes referred to as the overheads. And these costs are more difficult to determine because they are shared across many projects and activities, including things like maintenance and repairs of infrastructure, utility costs, insurance, the cost of the services provided to research, and so on. And institutions often then express this indirect cost as a rate, which then is applied to individual projects to cover their share of the overall indirect cost of the institution. So with the direct and indirect cost as the basis, a research project can be priced. It can be, the price can be the same as the cost, it can be higher than the cost, or it can be below cost. And a typical example would be when funders reimburse the indirect cost at a rate lower than the institutional indirect cost rate. So research costing is important for many reasons, including, I apologize for that, including the reasons that I have on the screen. So first of all, sustainability. Institutions can, by knowing what the research is actually costing them, assess the extent to which the funds they raise will cover the cost and to manage the shortfalls more strategically. Also considering that it's not only indirect cost where there could be that can run below cost, because there's often caps on other cost items, there's institutional contributions that's required, etc. So by having this information, they can more strategically manage the internal sources that are allocated to research, because the sustainability and growth of research is at risk if projects are constantly running below cost, especially where there already are infrastructure and other constraints within the institution. Transparency is a principle of financial management, but it also provides a solid basis to engage with funders on what they are funding, and more importantly also on what they are not funding and what the institution is contributing. Institutions want to keep their indirect costs as low as possible, and making the structures and systems and processes more efficient could help to achieve this and to reduce the indirect costs. So as I mentioned, for the next few slides, we will look closer at key 1, key 3, and key 5, and I'm going to hand back to Gary to discuss the next slide.
Great, thanks, Karen. So one of the areas that emerged early on, obviously back in the first edition and this edition, is really the attempt or the need for improved relations between funders and research institutions or researchers who work there. So it really, I call it a demystification of this relationship. And we have seen, not only anecdotally, but also with some changes in policies on both sides, where several agencies, including Wellcome Trust or other bilateral donors or NIH, either introduced reviews into this area and or changed some policies, or have had internal discussions and dialogues. And the good practice document here gives further guidance to funders and research institutions that also similarly we've seen really a reflection on how they approach direct and indirect costs over several years. But there's obviously more to do. And what we have here in terms of examples and cases that show really to show how they can funders harmonize their policies and their approach to this area, and also how to engage and deeper understand the institutions in countries and their financial and other arrangements, and better understand the dynamics by engaging in the dialogue with institutions, and better understanding the needs or research management and other research capacity needs. And in many times, Essence has offered, and we know that others do as well, this kinds of open dialogue and forums where some key challenges, be that, let's say, open data or other sensitive issues, or controversial or perhaps misunderstood issues, can be really discussed, and some of the detail can be unpacked. So that's what is being underlined here, and examples are given how we can do that better. Similarly, with researchers and research institutions, one needs to better understand the funders' policies or their expectations, and not be shy, and don't shy away from discussing, and not seeing the funder agency as, a brick wall that you cannot really jump over or do anything except for bang your head on. So only to say that a better understanding of funders is also sometimes helping in how one approaches them. And finding people or how to negotiate this through people who are working there, what are the best negotiating approaches in the process of application, etc., etc. There are other areas also here that kind of set here in this key in terms of transparency, etc., and communication with funders, and providing them with some of the policies and things that are developed that will be covered, are being covered in other keys. But really the main thing is the open dialogue and communication between funders and those who apply, and institutions in countries, and external funders as well. So over back to you, Karen.
Thank you, Gary. So I will then move on to case 3. If I can just get my slides to move on. There you go. So case 3 focuses on factors that enables institutions to be transparent when they cost research, and highlighting specifically the value of an institutional research costing policy and research support as 2 of these factors. So research support are offered at different stages of the research life cycle, and in this constantly changing, highly competitive and increasingly complex funding environment, the support that are provided will assist with the facilitation of access to funding opportunities to develop proposals and budgets, often providing tools, advice, and standardized costs that can be included in budgets, and ensuring that all of this are aligned with the funder requirements, and putting standard procedures in place for approvals, also approvals of waivers of indirect costs, and assisting with the grant agreements and grants management. And Katrina and other colleagues will share and elaborate more on how exactly they do this within their institutions. So the grant management component is extremely important in the context of research costing, but there are also other functions within research support, some of them listed here, and amongst them, supporting research policy development and implementation, including the development and implementation of an indirect cost recovery policy. And these policies would provide a consistent approach to the costing and pricing of research and guide the institutions in terms of the recovery and the management of the recovered indirect costs, because this can often be a very contentious issue. And therefore, one of the good practices also is that the development and implementation of such policies should involve stakeholders across the institution to ensure that there's this shared understanding and buy-in. And Dr. Engman will specifically speak about the policy implementation. So a common goal when supporting research really is to create this enabling environment, and one of the underpinning factors here is the relationship and the collaboration between the support staff and the researchers. And I believe that Katrina will also highlight the importance of this particular aspect. So there are many reports in literature referring to the administrative burden on researchers, and research support can play a significant role in reducing this burden and ensuring compliance and accountability that are so important in the funding space. So the effectiveness of research support depends on the institutional structures and systems that's in place, but it also depends on the skilled and competent individuals that provide the support. They are not general administrators, they are often highly specialized in their areas of support requiring specific skills and competencies. And there seems to be an increased awareness amongst institutions of the value of research support, more institutions investing in these areas, but also amongst funders. And the document provides examples of programs and initiatives that are funded and focus on the improvement of skills and capacity in the governance and support of research. One example is the Research Management Program in Africa, or REMPRO, that are managed by the African Academy of Sciences, funded by a number of international donors. And one of their outputs was the Good Financial Grant Practice that provides a tool for institutions to measure their compliance against international standards. Like TDR and Essence, REMPRO also collaborate with professional research management associations to help them to build skills and competencies for research support. And I'm conscious of the time, I'm just showing you this last slide that provides a snapshot of research management associations that are part of a global network. Those in the United States and some parts of Europe have been in existence for many years. But over the last couple of years, more recently, we have also seen them being established in low middle income countries. For example, BRAMA in Brazil, we have them in different regions of Africa. There's IRMI in India, and also the Malaysian Association of Research Managers and Administrators. And we have colleagues here that will share with us what they do. I can finally maybe just mention that the research management associations in sub-Saharan Africa collaborated to establish an international professional recognition council. And through this council, for the last 2 years, research managers in Africa can now apply for professional status by submitting a portfolio of evidence. So I think I will conclude with that, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Gary and Karen, for this. And Dr. Karen Dyson is the project manager, Research Management, Southern African Research and Innovation Management Association, ASARIMA. Thank you very much. Sasi.
Yeah, thank you, Franklin. Now it is my privilege to introduce Katrina Lawson. So Katrina is the Grants and Communication Manager at Oxford University Clinical Research Unit, and she's based in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. Is that right, Katrina? Yeah. She has more than 10 years experience in research management, and today she will share her experience about good practices in grant management to optimize cost recovery from research grant. Time is yours, Katrina. You have 15 minutes.
Thank you. Let me just open up my slides. Okay. So hi everybody, and thank you for that really nice introduction, Sasi. My name's Katrina. I work as grants manager at Oxford University Clinical Research Unit in Vietnam. Our program with Oxford University Clinical Research Unit is bigger than just Vietnam, though. Actually, we have sites in Vietnam and also Kathmandu in Nepal, and a large growing unit based in Jakarta in Indonesia. So we're really Oxford University Clinical Research Program based in sort of East Southeast Asia. We are part of the University of Oxford, as well as being based in Southeast Asia, and we are largely funded by Wellcome as part of the Africa and Asia programs. Our team that supports the grants for Oak Crew, as we're called, it's quite small actually. We have myself, I'm a grants manager. I also have other responsibilities in the unit, so I spend about half of my time doing the grants work. And I have 2 grants officers who also work to support. We process around somewhere between 70 to 90 applications each year. And we have a success rate of around 45% for those applications. But the thing that I really want to talk with you guys about is it's about the kind of the communication processes that you need to have in order to really support your researchers internally, as being part of the main thing that you need to do to be able to increase your, what is it that we're saying, optimize your funding recovery. Because in reality, for me, in my experience, the toughest customer and the biggest barrier for me to be able to really include all of those indirect costs in my research costing and in my proposal budget is often my own PI and my own research staff. Because one of the things that happens with the researchers is they tend to look at the pot of money they've got, and they like to think, well, I'm getting offered 100,000 by this funder, and I want all of that 100,000. I don't want my institution to tax 20% of that 100,000 and put it into an invisible pot of money that I'm never going to see. And so I feel like in our role as the grants team, our job is to help our researchers to understand and really buy into the idea that including those indirect costs is not taking them out of the project budget, it's adding it into the project budget in order to improve their own chances of success and invest in the capacity in their own institution. And that helps them to do things that they say they want to do, like reduce their administrative burden, for example. The reality is a lot of researchers don't realize that funders are often prepared to pay at least some of the indirect costs, and many times all of the indirect costs. And in particular, commercial funders, so if you're working with a pharmaceutical company, for example, they will pay all of the direct costs most of the time. But what is really important is that we have really a lot of transparency, and this comes up throughout the 5 Keys document, as well as the importance of transparency around what those indirect costs are, how they're calculated, and what they're going to be spent on. That's important to get our researchers to agree that they're important as well, because the researchers are so often the first point of contact with the funders and the primary point of contact with the funders. It's also important for the funders to trust that the costings we're giving them and the prices we're giving them really do reflect the real cost of research. Funders generally want to pay for the real cost of research. They don't want to pay a profit margin or something that they can't account for. So that's why, as an institution, we need to have some good financial practice as well as good grant management practice to help us to be able to account for our indirect costs and our other hidden research costs. My point that I'm going to try and make in the rest of my presentation is that our researchers need support to do this, to advocate for themselves and to work with the funders, but they need to trust us who are supporting them in the grants teams, maybe in the finance teams as well, to ensure that we really are protecting their interests. And so I'm going to present some strategies that you can maybe use if you're thinking about investing in your grant service in your institution, to try and build that trust with your researchers, to get them to think, yeah, actually, I do want to work with the grants team. I do want to include these costs in my research budget, and they're not. Therefore, then you don't have that internal barrier to including these costs in your budgets. So when I talk about grant support, the kind of things that we do that are maybe don't seem particularly relevant immediately to recovering costs are things like providing researchers with information about new opportunities that they might want to apply for, and helping them to apply for things, and working with them on developing their ideas for research projects well before they may even have a grant proposal to work on or even a budget to work on. Now, this is really, really key, because it does a couple of things for us. It helps us to catch a project really early so we can cost it accurately from the very beginning. It also helps them to trust us, because our researchers like to think that sometimes they think the administration office is just there to kind of say no to them or just put an approval or a red stamp. But if we're working with them right at the very beginning and kind of collaborating with them on their research ideas, that helps them to think, yeah, actually they care about what I want to do, and they're going to help me to succeed, so they can see the value of our role. And then therefore they're more willing to include some of those indirect costs in their projects as well. It's really important that your costings are coordinated, that you're working with other areas of your institution. And so, you know, in my team, we have to work with the clinical research department, we have to work with the labs, we have to work with your HR, we have to work with Oxford sometimes to ensure that we capture all of the costs that we might need to include in a research budget. But the grants team is a focal point for that. If you have a functioning grants team, they can do that on behalf of the researchers and kind of reduce that burden for the researchers and take away some of that mental load. The grants team also can provide a lot of compliance support. So things like checking your eligibility and giving support for collaborators as well. So, you know, if you have a skilled grants team, like Karen was saying, this is a bigger skill than just an administrator, someone who understands the research environment and understands how to read some of this quite complex information, then they're going to be able to look at these funded terms and conditions and really make sure that they notice all of the things that are eligible there, capture them and include them in budgets. But also, you know, I work with the University of Oxford, so we're not in some ways an LMIC organization, even though we're based in Vietnam, right? But we also do have a lot of researchers who are, I mean, most of our researchers are actually nationals in the countries where we work. And every single one of our research projects is in collaboration with a local institution in the countries where we work. And those local institutions, our collaborators, they need the support as well. So one of the things that the grants office can do, if your institution has a relatively well-established grants office, you can provide that leadership and support for your collaborators. And that is actually a really important part of capacity building, but also getting buy-in from your researchers, because they will come to you and say, can you help me to get this collaborator registered on an international system, for example. it's really important to get coordinated approvals. So, you want your researchers to be working with you, you want them to agree that it's important to include stuff. So your approval process it can't be a process of saying no. We don't have an approval process because we want to tell people you're not allowed to apply. We want to have an approval process because we want to tell people, when you apply, make sure you include all of these great things that are going to help your outcomes, going to help your success rate, and going to help you to deliver a really good project. And that process therefore needs to be coordinated. Working with your PIs, if you have your grants team working with the PIs, there's a lot of pre-award stuff that can happen that the PI doesn't actually know about at all. So things like setting it up on your financial system, or working with finance and contracts teams, things like that are quite invisible. But again, that is just taking that responsibility away from the PIs and doing that on their behalf to facilitate their willingness to work with you. But the other thing I would say is you can put in place systems and processes, you can put in place all kinds of rules in your organization, but every single investigator and every single project is individual, and they all have individual needs. So you also need to have some flexibility built in as an integral part of the process. There needs to be ways that you can build in exceptions. There needs to be ways that you can adjust your processes in order to fit to the different requirements from the different funders, the different schemes, the different projects. And so I think that is where sort of flexibility, maturity in your system is helpful. And when you can do that, then you're more likely to get buy-in from the researchers as well. If you have a very kind of fixed black and white yes and no process, your researchers are less likely to trust that you're actually interested in their and in helping them achieve their goals than if you have a process that, it has some pretty clear guidelines, but there's also some flexibility built into it. I just wanted to share a couple of examples. I might skip some of the post-award stuff of what we do. So for example, in our unit, we have a database of grant applications. So we track it, we know what we're doing, and that helps us to report our success rates and things like that. And it's really simple. It's not expensive stuff. We use Excel still. We use OneNote, we use a file server. But we also do things like this is an example of the email that our researchers get every month, which is just a list of funding opportunities. That email is not the way that they usually find their next grant application, but it is the way that they come and talk to us and they engage with us. And that's the reason why it's important for us to do that. Having a process in place for approval. The approval process is there, like I said, it's not so that you can say no to things. It's there so that you can make sure that along the way you've done all of the things that you need to do to ensure that you can do things like capture expenses, hidden costs, and quality control. This is what it looks like in my institution. This kind of chart, we use this chart all the time in training. We use it to show new researchers what we do. We use it in our grants writing training. We use it to train our staff as well. Because this sort of processes are documented. They help us to communicate within our own institution. In the grants team, you should be, in your organization, you should be identifying where there's a skill shortage. And this kind of matches with what Karen was saying before as well. Because you could need to provide training for your researchers or for your staff or for your finance teams. There could be many different kind of aspects of trainings that you can do that are tailored for your individual projects needs, your researchers' needs, or even just individuals. And so over the years, we've built quite a lot of these things into our service, and that helps our researchers trust us. I think it's important to separate grant management from finance. I think that they're different processes. They're obviously interlinked. And we obviously need to work closely with the finance teams when we do our grants work, but they have different roles and different responsibilities. So the finance teams are often much more transactional, much more post-award, whereas with the grants team, we're more pre-award heavy and more sort of bigger picture, so looking at what is the whole project about. And so again, this is about documentation. So this is an example that we have in our unit. We, the post-award setup, if a grant is awarded, then what happens? And we sort of say, well, these are the steps that we would go through to set it up. And in that second column there where it says lead, you can see the different roles, the funder, the PI, the grants team, the finance team, the strategic committee, what they do. And in our process, we describe the different roles and also the communication pathways, what happens next, who talks to who. This is about increasing transparency of how we do things and how we share information within the unit. And finally, I want to say it's really important to celebrate success. This helps, again, it's about building trust, but it's also about showing progress. If you've done a lot of these things, you will probably be able to pull some metrics out of the data that you've created. You can probably show the value of the work that you've done. For example, this is from a couple of years ago, actually in my own team, but showing the numbers of grant applications that we've worked with over the years. So, you know, a rapid rise from 25 in 1 year to, you know, 97 or so years later. And that shows our researchers, look, this is what we've done, this is what we've helped you with. And because we're doing this and we've put these processes in place, that means that you're able to build this capacity to do this more work. And those kinds of resources are really helpful, but also supporting your team. So we do use the Research Administrator Day every September 25th every year, though we did it on the 22nd one year. And just as an example, so this was with our Research Administrator Day celebration. Actually, we do research support. Anyone who supports research, we help celebrate them. We had an appreciation wall, got people to put Post-its and nice messages. This one I really like, was from a scientist to our administration teams, just saying that the administration, the grant support is as important to research as research is to science. And then my second favorite one is the one that the IT guys put up. So they say. It's been really nice to talk to everyone today, and I hope I've given you some insight or just a little different perspective. But if anyone has any questions, I'd be really happy to answer them. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Katrina. Very inspiring talk. I actually really like your quotes, the last quote. Yeah, so now it's time for Franklin to introduce our next speaker, Abena Engman. Please, Franklin.
Thank you, Sasi. So our next speaker is Dr. Abena Engman. She has several years of experience working as a research development officer at the Office of Research, Innovation and Development at the University of Ghana. She is currently a research fellow at the University of Ghana Medical Center. So Dr. Engman will speak about implementing an institutional indirect cost policy. Dr. Engman, over to you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Franklin, for that introduction. I'll quickly share my screen. So as Franklin said, I'm going to throw a little bit more light on indirect costs in our institutions when it comes to research, specifically implementing an institutional indirect cost policy. And my colleague speakers have already talked a bit about indirect cost, and I'm going to go a little bit deeper. So when we are talking about implementing an institutional indirect policy, there are two things that I want to draw our minds to. That you need to think about how much as an institution are you going to charge when it comes to indirect costs. And once those costs are recovered, how are you going to utilize those funds? How are you going to share them out? So I have this interesting picture. It has nothing to do with research, but I thought it will help us. So these are just cars. And if I were to ask all of us in the room here to tell us what are the immediate things that will come to mind that these cars will need to move, I am sure most of us, if not all of us, will say it is fuel and it is the car tires. And these things come to mind easily because this is what we think about. I just need to buy fuel into my car. I need to have tires under my car and the car will start moving. So relating it to research projects. So these cars are research projects, and immediately we think about research, we think about the activities that we are going to do to be able to undertake the research, and we are able to cost the research immediately. That is very easy. However, when you think about cars, once again, you need to think about the fact that there are other things that you need to think about, and they will also involve costs to keep this car moving, like the maintenance cost. You need to think about car insurance. You need to think about roadworthy. But those things usually don't come to our minds very readily. But that is the truth. If you don't think about maintenance, you don't think about car insurance, if you don't think about roadworthy, one of these days the car will grind to a halt. And like I said, sorry, previous speakers have already talked about indirect costs, but I just thought I should repeat it here since I am talking about indirect cost policy. So the direct costs are the costs that directly affect our projects, and they are easily identified because they are activities, and those activities will cost us, so we can cost them. When it comes to indirect costs, when it comes to research, they do not apply to one project. It cuts across all research activities within your organization or within your institution. And who funds these costs? Immediately what comes to mind is that when it comes to direct costs, it will be paid for by the funder. But I've put a question mark on indirect costs because we've had experiences where funders have refused to pay indirect costs. But whether we like it or not, those costs exist and they must be covered. Before I continue, I just want to repeat some of the costs, examples of indirect costs that we have when it comes to research. As an institution or organization, you need to think about the infrastructure. Where do your research administrative staff sit? Where do you house your laboratory? You need to think about maintenance of these buildings. You need to think about furnishing these buildings with furniture. You need equipment as well. You need computers and printers and photocopiers that the research administrative staff need to work with. You need to think about paying your bills. You have water, electricity, phone, garbage removal. Other examples include you want to hold workshops. So if you have young researchers, you want to hold workshops for them to build their capacity when it comes to, for instance, proposal writing, or there's a new equipment you want to train them to use, and that will cost money. You need to think about audit charges, legal charges, bank charges. You need to think about stationery. And most importantly, you also need to think about salaries and allowances that will have to go to the personnel. And as you realize that these things cut across research, it is not specific to one particular research. So these are some of the things that we need to think about before we think about the policy that we want to establish, because you need to know to be able that are involved when it comes to indirect costs. So how can you as an institution calculate your indirect costs? So when you look at Essence, it gives several ways and case studies of how institutions calculate their indirect costs. But one simple one I picked was, think about your total cost as an institution, and then how much of that cost relates to research. So if your institution has a total cost of $100,000 in a year, how much out of that $100,000 relates to research? Then you need to think about how much should you assign, what percentage of that cost should you assign to various projects that at the end of the year, you'll be able to cover those costs, and not just to cover the cost, but also to keep research going. So an example, for instance, we are about to start a clinical trial. And one of the requirements from the Food and Drugs Authority is for the research projects to have a separate office to be able to store documents and for personnel to be able to come and work. So that is for just one clinical trial. So if you want to do another one, we need to think about another office space because they cannot be housed in the same building. So that comes to the indirect cost of infrastructure and buildings. So not only do you need to maintain buildings, not only do you need to cover the cost of utilities or whatever, you need to start thinking of how to get more office space. And once you get the office space, you need to furnish it. So when you're thinking about indirect cost, it's not just covering the cost, but how do you cover the cost such that research can keep going on within your institution? From my experience that I've had so far, most of the time you have a single indirect cost rate applied. But sometimes if the institution, for instance, is an university and it has different schools, different colleges, some of the schools or the colleges have different ICRR rates, or they apply the same rate across the institution. So as you are setting up your policy, putting together your policy, these are some of the things that you need to think about. And you may think that some projects are bigger than others, but at the end of the day, whatever rate you come up with or whatever you decide as an institution, you realize that this will balance out altogether to be able to cover your cost. So when you are thinking about your institutional, so some of the things that you need to think about when you are establishing a policy in relation to indirect costs. You need to know that as funders are increasingly changing, at first, most funders didn't want to pay indirect costs to researchers, but this is increasingly changing. But yet still, there are some that do not pay indirect costs, and others do not tell you at all about indirect costs. So they do pay, but if you do not make a conscious effort to find out what percentage they pay out of the total direct cost, you will not know and they will not tell you. Some also have a maximum percentage that you can charge. So as an institution, you have decided that if you tell each project to pay 20% as indirect cost, that is your policy. But some funders do not pay 20%. So for instance, when it comes to NIH, they have a maximum of 8% that they pay to African institutions, and that cannot be changed. Some also pay a flat rate, like I just gave the example about NIH. And some also ask you to justify your indirect cost. So going back to the cost that I shared, if you list them, you need to find justifications as to why you are charging for those indirect costs. Because some funders, even though they pay for indirect costs, they will ask you to justify the costs. So as you are drawing up your policy, you need to also start thinking of justifications of those items in your indirect cost. Now, when it comes to the principal investigator, truth be told, some principal investigators do not know about the fact that they need to charge indirect costs. All that they are thinking about is about the activities to get the research done and costing those activities. And some principal investigators are just in a hurry to sign the contracts and get the research going. So they do not look at the fine details. And that's where they need the support of the research administrators, the grant managers, to be able to look at the contracts and point out things that they may not have seen. So as an institution, do not assume that every researcher knows about indirect costs. You need to make a conscious effort to educate them about the importance of the indirect cost. As an institution, you can also negotiate with funders for indirect costs. So they don't tell you and you don't know, or they tell you and they say we will not pay, or we pay a reduced rate. But as an institution, you do have a right to negotiate for your indirect costs. And with some institutions that have grown in research, choose not to apply for some grants at all if their indirect costs are not covered. And if a principal investigator does not include indirect costs in their budget, you need to have a discussion with the PI and let them know that it is important that some of the costs have to be covered. For instance, if there needs to be an audit, who is going to pay the audit fees if there are no indirect cost charges? So you need to have a discussion with the PI that some of these costs will still need to be covered. And as an institution, as the years go by, you can review your indirect cost rate. It's not cast in stone. You can review it as your research progresses and all that. You can review your indirect cost rates. And yes, I will see the other point I wanted to make in the next slide. So once you have your indirect cost, what happens? So this is an example of a policy of an institution. So when they recover the indirect cost, what happens? Who does the money go to? So there's a share out policy, and it's usually done in percentage terms. And of course, the first beneficiary of indirect costs is the institution because of all the costs that we have mentioned. But then the principal investigators, they belong to a school, they belong to a department, they belong to a college. And they would also have incurred some costs when it comes to the research, when it comes to housing the principal investigator, his research assistants, his laboratory and all that. So you want to give some of that indirect cost that you have recovered to either the school, the college, or the department. But if you have all those three, you decide to give them a percentage. What it also does is to encourage the school or the college to engage in more research. It also helps them to build their own facilities that they will need. And then some of the funds can go to an internal research fund. And you realize that for some funders, for some researchers are asked to provide some basic data to be able to access that grant. And young researchers, upcoming research, will need funding to be able to collect basic data and then qualify to access bigger grants. And you also want to encourage people to grow in their careers. So as an institution, as an organization, you can set up an internal research fund where you put a percentage of the indirect cost that you have recovered into that fund and have your own grants that you give out to young researchers. And then you also want to give some of those indirect costs to the principal investigator who may want to use those funds to attend a conference and also to encourage them to engage in more research. So if you have recovered indirect costs, these are some of the people or institutions or units that you may consider to share out that indirect cost that you have recovered. Some good practices I also picked from Essence and I thought were important to share is, as an institution, try and reduce your indirect costs. Try and encourage people not to waste a lot of the resources that they have. If you don't need to print something, don't print it. Have an electronic system so that you reduce the amount of money that you spend, for instance, on stationery. If there's no one in the room, let's put off the lights so that we incur less electricity bill. And as an institution, make sure you calculate your indirect cost such that it covers all the infrastructure and all the necessary support so that you can continue doing research and do competitive research. And you also need to make sure that your costs are transparent and they are defendable. Like I said, some funders will ask you for justification of your indirect cost rate. And for funders, it is important that they know that their funding policies either encourage or discourage researchers from doing more research. And other funders are encouraged to meet together and see how they can support institutions, low middle income countries to do research. And that indirect cost is very important to sustain the research. Thank you very much. This is the end of my presentation, and I hope I've been able to give you some useful information to be able to develop your own internal policy when it comes to indirect costs. And I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Emma. Over to you, Sasi.
Yeah, thank you, Franklin. So now we will present our last speakers for today's webinar. We will hear
Hello,
from...
Sasi.
Hello, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you now.
Yeah. Now we will hear from Professor Dr. Saliza Ibrahim and Dr. Tan Xiaowei about the role of Research Management Association. Professor Saliza Ibrahim is the president of the Malaysia Association of Research Managers and Administrators, and associate vice chancellor at the University Malaya, Malaysia. And Dr. Tan Xiaowei is the secretary of MIRMA and head of Research Management Strategy and Policy Unit at University Malaya, Malaysia. Without further ado, I'll give the time for you, Professor Saliza.
Thank you, Sasi, and thank you to the organizers for giving us this opportunity to give this presentation. So I will be presenting the first part on the association, and Dr. Tan Xiaowei will continue with the second part on our experience with costing. Okay, next. Okay, so I'd like to share about the history of the association. We actually started with a project called the Malaysian Research Management and Governance Project. And that was funded under the Newton Fund. So in Malaysia, it was called Newton Unku Omar Fund. It was a partnership grant between the British and the Malaysian government. The motivation for this project was, in fact, to have research management recognized as a professional job. Because at that time, we were very much seconding academics to head research management units to handle research processes. And we were, as public institutions, were also having officers who were doing their work on a rotation basis. So they would be at a unit for a certain number of years and move to the next. So the continuity of research management was being affected. And therefore, we felt the need to have a group of people who would specialize in research management. And that's actually was a very successful project. And one of the outcomes was to have professional research managers being recognized as a group of specialized people in the whole research management team. And incidentally, in that project as well, the other outcomes are on measuring research impact, which we look at impact in terms of the impact beyond academia. And that is now being considered for the Malaysian Research Assessment by the Higher Education Ministry. The other one is data curation and repository. We're looking at research data sets, and that now has taken to the level of being launched as a Malaysian Open Science Platform by the Academy of Sciences Malaysia under the Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation. And the fourth area was actually full economic costing based on the transparent approach to costing based on the model that we learned from the UK counterpart. For this one, we're still at institutional level because we are still working to educate and to convince funders particularly. If Katrina said her main challenge was the PIs, for us, I think probably funders, because they feel that they would have to give more money, but we are working on it. Next. So my IRMA was established in 2019. It was officially approved by the Registrar of Societies. It is a national level association and is open to individuals and organizations interested in or supporting research management objectives. So these namely are the higher education institutions, research universities, research agencies, we have research centers, and also funders. Okay, next. And what was the significance of having MyRMA? It shows our readiness to upgrade the management and administration of research in Malaysia to a professional level on par with international practices. And we also received the approval or the nod from the public, the administrative unit in the government that this could be approved. And the MyRMA also aims to be a platform for research managers and administrators from public and private academic institutions, because in Malaysia, there's slight differences between how the public and the private institutions work or operate. Research agencies as well as funders to interact, to exchange ideas and to collaborate in various activities so that we can understand each other more and understand more about the diverse or the broad scope of research management. And this is expected to contribute towards enhancing the effectiveness of research management and the quality of the research itself, because a lot of times we feel how the research progresses depends a lot on the support that we provide, and as well as the outcome and the impact of the research. Next. So we have our vision and mission. We are currently very, we emphasize on having impactful research, and we are encouraging researchers to go beyond the academic impact. So having societal impact, economic impact, environmental impact, all that is very much being encouraged now. And we are educating our researchers as well about pathway to impact and so on. So this requires the research managers also to understand about this. Okay, next. Yeah, so the types of membership for MyRMA, we are open to individuals as well as organizations, and individual members carry 1 vote, whereas institutional members carry 3 votes, and they're entitled to register all relevant staff as individual members if one becomes an institutional members. And we also have honorary members, which are by invitation only. Next. So since our inception in 2019, we had like 6 months and then we had a lockdown, but nevertheless, we've tried to do online activities. We did manage to do some upskilling workshops, which were very well received on various topics. And we also have sharing of best practices, and we plan to do more roundtable discussions on best practices with the different universities and different institutions. We do engagement with local and international counterparts. We do a lot of engagement with Japan and Australia, as well as the European Association. And we conduct talks on research management and related areas. And also we look at career pathway for research managers, because we have started to recruit personnel solely for research management, so that we won't be taking any more academics for this job, but they are looking at what is their future in their career, and making them understand the diverse roles in research management. And one of them, research impact, about impact writing and measurement, looking at open science. At the moment, our research managers are having to do the data stewardship work as well, and full economic costing, mainly, as I said, to create awareness as well as educating at all levels, and now developing a template on how do we calculate the indirect cost, the estate cost, and so on. So I think my presentation is up to here, I believe, and Dr. Tan will continue with the second part. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So just to share with you how we started with the indirect costs. Basically, we are relatively quite young in collecting or trying to recover indirect costs from research projects. All this started from our first policy back in 2014. It was developed, approved, and implemented starting from 2014. So at that time, our policy was covering mainly to cover the management and administration costs. And then it was calculated based on a certain percentage of the total direct costs. So a year immediately after the announcement, we kind of started with a lot of awareness work and tasks and go around and explain with our researchers the importance of the indirect costs, and then the benefits of having indirect costs, trying to encourage them to put into their research budget and things like that. So at the same time, we thought creating awareness is not just might not be enough. So the research office actually come up with an idea to actually provide a service to help and prepare research budget, research project budget for the researchers. So basically, in general, I would say we have two groups of researchers, and one group would be very established researchers, and they are very well versed in preparing research proposals. And most of the time, traditionally, they actually prepare the proposals and together with the costing and budget by themselves. So we need to work really closely with them, and then to really to convince them how they would benefit from incorporating the indirect costs in their proposals. So, so there are a lot of obstacles at that time. And then like what Katrina said, that we actually will have to build some trust with the researchers so that they will listen to us and try out to include the indirect costs into their project proposals. So slowly we can see some changes when we interact with them. They send their proposal to us, they send their budget costing to us, and then at the research office, we kind of help them to check if the budget is covering all the direct costs and indirect costs that could support their research project. So that is one part of our experts who are very well versed in preparing research project budget. And we have another group of people who are early career. They are not that good in preparing their proposals, and especially in terms of budgeting. So for this group of people, we actually sit down with them. They are very, I would say, more receptive than the other group of researchers that we have. We can easily talk to them and then sit down and show them how the costing can be done. So the approach that the research office at that time was to sit down together with the researchers and develop the costing together. Not to like ask them to send us whatever details and then we prepare the budget and then send it back. So the intention was to actually kind of also do some training for the researchers. So that they know where those numbers comes from. And in the future, if they move to somewhere else, at least if there isn't any service provided to them, they can have a knowledge of preparing their budget themselves. So that was the intention why we want to sit down and work with them. And then after a few years of, I think 3 years, so we took about 3 years, we can see increment in the receptiveness among the researchers. And back in, and then during that 3 years time, when we implement the policy, slowly the research office also learned from whatever we have done, and also especially from the international grant funders. So as I said, initially we only include the management and administration fee costs in the indirect cost. But slowly in 2018, we had a revision of our policy. And the policy actually, for us to include more aspect of indirect in the policy. And then up to now, I think it's already like 7 years. We can see a lot of improvement. Researcher actually, sorry, researcher actually kind of call us up very often when they wanted to apply for grants. They can kind of automatically, request for help in looking into their budget, or some of them even request to actually prepare the budget for them and things like that. So yeah, I would say it's kind of a positive sign for us throughout the 7 years. And we can also see some recovering of costs, not at a very high percentage per project, but at least there are some improvement in terms of the institutional indirect costs. So yeah, continuously, we actually looking into different methods in preparing the indirect costs. As Prof. Liza mentioned just now, we actually participate in one of the national projects. And then through the national projects, actually, we came across the full economic costing and use the track is the transparent approach to costing method. So we are continuously exploring how we can improve the calculation of the indirect cost. So we look forward for any improvement in the coming, I think, 1 or 2 years. So I think that's all from I would like to share about the journey of as of this moment, but at least we are not stopping here. We will still continue to improve in terms of costing of our research project. I think that's all from us. Oh, sorry. Last one would be from the research management side. We actually also established a journal, Journal of Research Management and Governance, which we published our first issue in 2018. And this year is coming to the 5th issues of our journals. So we welcome all interested colleagues to submit your whatever papers, short communication to the journals. And okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Tan, Professor Salisa. And Dr. Tan, if you don't mind, could you please share the link to your journal in the chat box so audience can look at your journal online?
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
So thank you very much, everyone. Now we will start the Q&A answer. And thank you for all of the panelists. Most of the question actually already answered in the Q&A box. So if you want to read the answer, please read them. But there are several questions that will be answered by Gary and Katrina live. I will give the first opportunity to Gary. There's the question from Madhuri Duta. Would you like to respond to that question now?
Sure, that's fine. So the question, for the benefit of the others, is whether or not Essence can organize discussions around certain policies. In this case, an additional kind of wrinkle or complication is that countries have different policies, how monies are coming in and out, and restrictions on foreign currencies and things like that. And there is experience here. So from 2 countries mentioned here. So what I can say is we can obviously discuss certain things, but certain things also have limits of how much one can influence, because some of these restrictions are not only around research, but there are some other issues that are in play, and research is obviously on government's mind, but sometimes not number one. But I'm definitely going to add this to the list of things for us to explore, how we can hear more of experiences and how people deal with these issues in different places. There might be some lessons that people can learn from each other from different countries. I know for a fact we have several programs where funding goes through one institution, then it distributed to others in other countries, other currencies, or there's some scope for this to look at good practices. Thanks for bringing this up. Should I go to which one? So I'm yes, sure I'm doing.
Yeah.
There are a couple to Katrina specifically. Then there is one, many funders provide indirect costs. There are few agencies that will not allow for indirect costs. How can this be improved? Ha ha ha. Okay, Karen can also chip in. But in general, the trick is, or the answer is that, okay, if the policy is that there are no funding for indirect costs, you try and put in everything as much as you can in direct costs. And I guess see how that works and negotiate around that. If there really is the policy that there is no indirect cost at all. And Karen, do you want to add anything to that?
And I think that is true, Gary, because that's what funders who they are sometimes limited by their own policies and constituencies, so they do fund limited indirect costs. But even advice from those funders would be to work with them to see if some of the indirect costs can move up to the direct cost and be funded in that way. Some of them would allow indirect costs to also be included as the institutional contribution in grants, for example. So I think those would be the two things that they typically would say. But then also in general, more broadly, I think what this document and the engagement between funders and institutions are trying to do is to create this awareness of the need to fund indirect costs, and for those who are able to change their policies to get them to think about that. And we've seen, as you said earlier, also some movement and change in this regard. But yes, I think trying to put as much as possible in direct costs and seeing if you can at least cover some of those as the institutional contribution would be two ways to do that.
And there is a question on rent. Rent can be both direct and indirect costs depending on the justification of the costs, and it's for the support of the project, then it's okay to include as direct. So, I mean, I think you kind of have your answer in the question, but maybe we can see whether or not what was the experience for, I don't know, for Abena or for TAN, to see how do they approach rent. I don't know, maybe there's good experiences or how you use that. Unless Karen, you wanted to add anything on that one?
No, I think it would depend. The answer there is correct. I mean, it would depend on the funding opportunity also. So if it's possible to include rent for that particular project, obviously that can be included as the direct cost, but rent more broadly at an institutional level will be part of the indirect cost and recovered in that way. It would depend a bit on what the funding opportunity is.
Right. I don't know if Abena or others wanted to add to that specific one.
No, I think that's what our experience has been, just like Karin said. It depends on the funder, but most of the time it's part of your indirect cost. Yes.
Right. Okay, great. So the other questions are for Katrina. So maybe I'll hand over to Katrina.
Okay, hi, thanks. So there was a question, which was what are the innovative ways a grants manager can use to budget for support the sustainability of the research program? Because, you know, grant applications take time, consume resources, and yet you have this problem of researchers resisting the recovery of indirect costs. I mean, I think this is the bit that I'm trying to get at, which is researchers resist because they don't understand that recovering these costs can actually help them to achieve more resources. I think that if you're an institution that has not got a lot of support, like a lot of grant support, so I know there's a lot of institutions in Asia, for example, where there's not a lot of grant support, they don't have grant offices, and they're trying to justify ways to invest in that within their institutions. I think that there's a very easy argument to be made, which is simply that the grants office investment will pay for itself, because what you will be doing will be ensuring that you're adding those indirect costs because you're doing accurate costings into your project budgets. And so then when things are funded, the indirect costs are recovered in a way that they're probably not being recovered now. And then those funds can be spent to fund that program and it is sort of an investment cycle. And so I think that it's partially about educating the researchers in your institution to get them to understand how including these costs in their budgets can actually benefit them. There's potentially some sort of political advocacy that might need to happen within your institution as well, and maybe some creative deal that you might need to make with the executive to say, okay, so if I get, 10 grants approved this year at 20% cost of indirect costs, 10% of those indirects goes to the executive and 10% goes to funding the grant service. What do you say? Something like that. I think that, that's the kind of strategy that you need to use to kind of set those things up. That's my advice.
We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
It's my connection.
Yes, we can hear you now.
You can hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry, I just got a thing up saying my connection's unstable. Apologize for that. Someone said they would like to be able to see successful proposals and grant applications. This is something I get requested for a lot. Actually, within my own unit, we have worked with our researchers. So we have developed a repository of, this is something that the grants team in your institution could potentially do as well, of grant applications that they're still confidential, but we redact them. So we take out some budget information, we get the permission of the principal applicant, and we put them into a repository. So when someone is looking for a specific grant application, they can find an example, oftentimes to the same funder or a similar kind of project that we can share with them. I don't know about any publicly available repositories. Some of you guys may know, but I think that if you are working in an institution, then this is a pretty easy thing that you can put in place in your institution as a grants officer, that again helps to build that that trust, because it's pretty easy to do. It's just a matter of creating a repository, cleaning out confidential data, and getting people's consent. And in my experience, it's very, very unusual for investigators to not consent. But I would also say, in my experience, most principal investigators are quite happy if you approach them personally and say, what could I see the application for that grant that you did? Quite often they're very happy to share that themselves. So I would also advise early career researchers to go and talk to other researchers in your field and ask them to share information with you. That was the end of my question. Someone asked about grant writing resources, but I don't know off the top of my head where to go to for that. So there might be something that someone else can answer.
Yeah. Thank you, Katrina and Gary. I think we have answered all of the questions here. Yeah. So maybe maybe before we close this session, actually we have a short poll for all of you. Maybe you have 1 minute. Can you please vote? Does this webinar relate to your daily research practice, and has your knowledge about research costing improved after participating in this webinar? It will be great to know your answer for this quick poll. Yeah, we see many positive response here. Almost 96% says that this webinar relate to daily practice, and 94% answer that their knowledge improve after participating in this webinar. So thank you very much, everyone, for participating in the poll. And now I will give the time to Franklin to close this webinar.
Right, thank you very much, Sasi. And we would like to say a big thank you to our presenters, Dr. Gary Aslian, Dr. Karen Dyson, Dr. Abena Engman, Dr. Katrina Lawson, and Professor Dr. Shaliza Ibrahim, as well as Dr. Tanway, for your expertise and spending time with us today. Also, many thanks to all our attendees for making time to attend this webinar. Tomorrow, we shall send an email with a recording of the webinar, and this will be shown with a link to YouTube where you can watch the recording. So once again, thank you all for coming. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.